Welcome to another Sad Boys book review. My name is Dusty, and I read Dune by Frank Herbert. And you think if I was smart, I would have released this around the time that during the height of Part 2 being in theaters to try and hit some sort of algorithm, but perks of being lazy, I guess. So here we go, yeah. I started this book back in 2021 to get ready for Part 1 of the Denis Villeneuve adaptation, and I only read. I'm gonna call it part one. So this book is separated into like three different parts, but he calls it book one, book two, book three, which is very confusing when you're reading book one of a six-book series. So I'm just gonna refer to them as part one, part two, part three. So I read part one, which only covers through to be uh, about as ambiguous as I can because unlike the Assassin's Blade video, I'm going to go back to my spoiler-free as best as I can format for the Sad Boys book reviews. Um, it's when the end of book part one is when Paul and Jessica are in the tent, and he has his whole conversation with Jessica inside the tent. That's the end of part one of the book, whereas part one of the movie actually ended much further into part two than I expected. So I had read that much. I read part one in 2021, and in order to get ready for part two coming out in March of 2024, I decided to finish the rest of the book, and I really liked it. I know that's probably a remarkable hot take that nobody has ever had before. But yeah, I'm a sci-fi nut, as anybody who listens to the book club can tell you. I love fantasy as well as anybody who listens to these book reviews can tell you as well. And I feel like Dune is a very, it's mostly sci-fi, but I feel like it hits a lot of kind of what are now maybe seen as some fantasy tropes as well. I struggle to call it a trope in the context of Dune, given that this book came out in the I think it was the 1960s, and it's very much a progenitor to a lot of modern sci-fi fantasy. You can see a lot of its influence in Star Wars. A lot of its influence in Star Wars. George Lucas was not afraid to wear his influences on his sleeve when writing Star Wars, which is fine. This is not me, shitting on Star Wars at all. I love Star Wars. It's one of my favorite things. But you can definitely see reading Dune where Lucas got a lot of his inspiration for Star Wars in it. It does have very much a white Jesus savior complex with Paul, which I do find funny in retrospect. But I do like the writing of Paul's character. I think it's got a great cast of characters. I think Chani is probably the worst character in the book, mostly because she is barely a character in the book. And that's one point that I will definitely give the movie adaptations in favor of over the book is Zendaya's portrayal as Chani is much better than how she was written in the books. So credit to Villeneuve and Zendaya where it's due for doing a great job with a character that I thought was relatively one note in the book itself. Which isn't to say that it's a massive slight against the book. It's just kind of whatever. The purpose that she exists to serve in the book is served, and it's not the focus of the book or really Paul's character outside of his familial ties themselves. Yeah, Jessica is a great character, one of my favorites in the book. Paul is very well written. He's not probably my favorite character. I think my favorite would probably be either Jessica or Stilgar, if I'm being honest. They're both just really fun, well written characters in the book. Yeah, it's kind of crazy how modern it feels reading it still, because you think reading a book from that's like almost, if not 60 years old, there's going to be some a little bit of a disconnect with modern prose or modern writing techniques, especially like if you go back and read Tolkien, which Lord of the Rings came out only about a decade before Dune, so there's not a really big gap between the two of them. And if you read Lord of the Rings, you know that the language is, for lack of a better term, much harder to digest than something you would read today, like something like, and this is don't take this for anything more than just a direct comparison of the language used itself. Something like Aragon. which came out in the mid 2000s to the 2010s. Um, the language for someone today reading Aragon, they're going to have a much easier time reading it than they would The Lord of the Rings. Once again, don't take this as a comparison of quality between the two. They're two completely separate books. And yes, Lord of the Rings is objectively better, but once again, this is just purely the language. So yeah, with Dune being as old as it is, it's kind of surprising how easily digestible it is compared to other fantasy novels of its time. Um, I know a lot of people see this as one of the earlier, like one of the Godfather of sci-fi books. Obviously, there's been sci-fi before Dune. Frankenstein being a very notable one, but you can see a lot of the kind of modern, like I said earlier, there's a lot of what are considered tropes now that you can see in Dune that were done really well. So yeah, I don't know. I'm dancing around a lot of things because I once again don't want to go too deep into spoiler territory. But yeah, this book really does feel right up my alley as well in a lot of ways because there is a lot of political intrigue in the book, which, if anybody knows, that's one of the things I love in a good fiction is a nice political theater to play around in, and Dune definitely has that in spades. There are good amounts of action sprinkled in here and there, but one thing I would say is not to Herbert's strength is action. I don't think he can write action scenes as well as other authors, which is totally fine. You don't have to be. I feel like you'd be giving him too much credit to say he's the villain of the book. Fade Rauth definitely felt a little more one-dimensional in the book. He kind of really only exists to be the final barrier for Paul to surpass to reach his end goal of his character arc, which works fine for the context given. But to give another point to the movie is I really enjoy the expounding on his character that they did in the movie to make him more of a what felt like a real threat to the movie itself rather than just being an obstacle. Yeah, it was very good book. Not really sure what more I can say without repeating myself and without going into plot details. It's definitely a high recommend for me, especially if you're into sci-fi, if you're into a somewhat older take on it that might have a couple of sticking points that for something of its age, technology has definitely surpassed Dune in some ways. Obviously, things like space travel and things like that. But still, I think something. Well, actually, no. Let me rephrase that because a lot of contemporary sci-fi, or maybe not contemporary, but a lot of older sci-fi, a lot of older settings. Something like Neuromancer, for example, because of the limitations of not having the foresight to see into the future and what technology might hold in the future, it can kind of create a bit of a I don't want to say anachronism because I don't think that's quite what I'm trying to say, but it can create a situation where you're looking at what's supposed to be futuristic technology and you look at something in your house and it's more technologically advanced than this book that's supposed to take place in the future. For example, Neuromancer, infamously, the opening line, the sky looked like a like the static of a television set or something like that. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing, and how we don't have that snow on TVs anymore. That's something that older people might remember is when you don't have the channel set correctly and you're on something that does not have a satellite broadcast, it would create that I've heard it called fuzz and snow, but the yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Like, that's not really a thing anymore. And there's still payphones in Neuromancer, and that's a very rare sight in the modern world. So there's a lot of times in older sci-fi where technology doesn't quite match the future itself. And while there are some things that definitely feel futuristic, there are a lot of things that feel archaic relative to the time in which you're reading this, the technology around you in the real world. And I actually do feel like Dune does a great job of not falling into that trap. Everything does feel somewhat futuristic, and maybe there are a couple of things that you look at it and you're like, we probably have something better in insert current year here than this item that Paul is using or whatever. But I do feel like it does do a really great job of, even to this day, feeling like the future. and I think that's a really great strength in Frank Herbert's writing, and the ability to create these worlds that still to this day feel like a future and not like a future relative to 1960. So yeah, very very good book, very good world building. I haven't read Dune Messiah yet, but I look forward to reading it in the future, whenever that might be. Um, yeah, it's a ride, man. I felt gripped the whole time. It's a real page turner. I never felt like any part was slogging. Um, it's a really fun read, and I highly highly recommend it. So with that, I'd give Dune a 9 out of 10. Highly recommend it. Go check it out if you haven't already, or if you've seen the movie and you like the movie, check out the book. Really really good. So yeah, that'll about cover it. So thank you for listening. It's been another Sad Boys book review. My name's Dusty, and take care.